What is going on today, YouTube? How are y'all doing? Hope you guys are doing well. It is Saturday, August 16th, and I wanted to get on here and make this video, talk about Loudon County Trucking and my experience with them, as well as kind of clear some things up from one of the last videos I made about them. I've kind of been reading through some of the comments, and people had questions, and kind of got back to watching some of my older videos, and I wanted to clarify a couple things. So let's get into it, y'all. Like I said, I hope you guys are doing well. I got some notes here. I want to make sure I kind of cover everything. So starting out, when I was talking with recruiting, one of the things that really caught my eyes, in the job posting, it said, oh yeah, you can gross $1,500 plus a week and be home on weekends. And when I was talking with recruiting, they were like, yeah, our drivers are averaging $1,500 plus a week. You'll be home every weekend. You can stay out more if you want, but we can have our drivers home every weekend. And, once you got talking about where I lived and everything, she was like, yeah, you live in a great area, a great freight lane, living right off I-40 and then the I-40 corridor. We've got all types of customers out that way, Don't be surprised if you're in and out of the house throughout the week, yada, yada, yada. So it sounded great. Ultimately, that's why I went with them. When we got to orientation, of course, they pay for your hotel, pay for your rental, pay for your lunch. Everyone was super friendly. They take you in, they introduce you to a bunch of different people. They introduce you to the shop. They show you how to, fill out tickets, see if you got to go, in for maintenance or whatever. If you need, more securement equipment, where you can get it at, who to talk to if you need something. They introduce you to your dispatcher. They have a full, open door policy. If you need to go in and talk to somebody, you can. And I thought that was cool, especially getting to meet your dispatcher, because a lot of companies, you don't ever really get to do that. So I thought that was cool. It lasted about 2 or 3 days. It was really, you're just waiting for your drug test to come back, and then you get your truck and trailer and you get to head out. Speaking of equipment, they've got pretty good equipment. I've seen better, I've seen worse. It's not fully loaded, you're not getting a fully spec'd out truck or trailer or anything, but overall pretty well maintained. Most of the trucks are going to be Freightliners. They do have some Volvos as well as some Internationals. I think I saw a couple of Peterbilts towards the end. I've heard of people getting some Peterbilts, but something I've noticed was a lot of the Internationals were actually, and so even some of the Freightliners were from P&S, which I'll get into that in a minute. But overall, like I said, not fully loaded trucks, but pretty good. The trailers are typically 48 feet. There's a couple 53s. I had a 53 foot. Of course, they're all kind of Stogas. Cool thing about the way they do trailers is you don't do dropping hooks. Once you get assigned a trailer, that is pretty much your trailer. Unless they are exchanging it out, they're going to get rid of that one. It's at the end of its life cycle and they're going to exchange it with a new one, or you just have some serious breakdown or maintenance issues with that trailer, then you'll get a different one. But overall, once you get a trailer, it's your trailer. And that's pretty cool because you can set it up how you like. So, of course, mine, like I said, having a 53 foot, you get a little extra space compared to most, and with Loudon hauling a lot of coils, you really don't need a whole lot of space. So all my equipment was in the front of my trailer, had it set up, and I wish I had a picture to show y'all, but it was nice to be able to do that and keep everything, set up how you want, and, makes it a little bit easier. So that was cool. Overall, like I said, equipment was pretty good. Like I said, not fully loaded. My first truck with them was a 2016 Cascadia. It actually had a legacy seat in it. I don't know how I got a legacy seat, but it had a legacy seat in it. Super comfy. I see why those seats are so expensive now. Life-changing, I swear. Had 600,000 miles on it. It wasn't a terrible truck. It did 68 miles an hour. It wasn't automatic. Only issue I ever had with that truck was one where I think it was in Prescott, Arkansas, I got backed into by some raghead twice. Really pissed me off, really irritated me, but was what it was. So they were already talking about getting me a different truck. Sorry if I was a little distracted. I'm trying to figure out what the hell am I hearing. I don't know. Thought someone was pulling in. My bad. Anyways, so Prescott, Arkansas, got rear-ended twice. Or not rear-ended, but backed into twice. They were talking about getting me a different truck because of that. And then I was heading back to Alcoa from Murfreesboro, Tennessee. When I left Murfreesboro, everything was fine. I was on I-40, stopped in to see my wife and daughter, and noticed a bunch of oil leaking from the rear end, and it actually blew a seal out in the rear end. So they had the truck towed. I got a different truck. I ended up with I think a 2023 Cascadia. They only had 60,000 miles on it, and it was super, super clean, super nice. Only problem is it only did 66, but not a big deal. Other than that, pretty good equipment. When it gets into, looks at home time, you can go home every weekend if you want. If you try to stay out, from my experience, they really don't have enough freight to keep you out. So every time I tried to stay out longer, they're like, well, we really don't have anything to keep you moving over the weekend. You're probably going to end up sitting. So I usually just went home every weekend. Speaking of loads, that was the biggest problem with Loudon, is they didn't have enough freight to keep you moving. So, talked about with orientation and talking with the recruiter, they said there was a lot of freight in my area. Well, why is it that I was always driving over 2.5 hours to Alcoa every time I left the house? I'd always have to drive out to Alcoa. And then the problem with Alcoa, and so you'd go out to Arconic. And Arconic, I think the least amount of time I ever sat waiting to get loaded was 4 to 4.5 hours. On average, I usually always ended up doing a 10-hour break, waiting to get loaded. I almost guarantee that I would spend at least a total of at least one day throughout a 5-day work week sitting at Arconic. And that's really, really frustrating. So it's, not a terrible, you pick up coils. I don't mind doing coils. It just sucks having to sit there and wait. Also didn't run I-40 a lot. Rarely ever ran I-40. I primarily ran I-75. Would go up to Ohio, Michigan, places like that. And would sit waiting for a load. Then I'd get some load coming back. Would usually always end up back at Arconic. One time I ran out to Texas. Going to Texas paying pretty good. Coming back paid ass. So that was the big problem with Loudon, and that's a big reason why I left. There wasn't enough freight to keep you moving, which means you weren't really making money. Now, and that's one of the things I was talking about with P&S, is that it seems like, according to a lot of people who were there for a while, that once they got bought out by P&S, they lost a lot of their good freight lanes, and P&S took them. So I think the best lane that they've got is really anything coming out of Arconic. That's their main customer. Other than that, there isn't a whole lot. So, and I heard there used to be just freight everywhere. You could make $2,000, gross $2,000 easy at Loudon. Apparently not anymore. So that's just what I've heard. I wasn't there to experience that, but that is what I heard, because of course, like I said, they were bought out by P&S Logistics. So when it comes to pay, you get paid 27% of the load. And most of the time that works out pretty well. I had loads that I was making well over $1 a mile. I think the most I ever made was like $1, probably $1.15 roughly a mile. And you're a company driver, you're not lease purchase. I mean, I think they have lease purchase, but that was as a company driver, that's amazing. But there's also loads where I was 55 cents a mile. Now on average, I think my average pay was like right around 86, 87 cents a mile. Like I said, I had a few that were well over $1 a mile, had a few that were right at $1 a mile. The lowest paying one was one I brought back from Texas that was only 35 cents a mile. I don't even know how they made money on that load. Because they show you what the line haul was, and then you get 27% of that. So that was pretty cool. But again, the problem was they didn't have enough freight to keep you moving. So yeah, I might pull 2 or 3 loads that are paying $1 a mile, but all in all, I'm only getting $900, for that week. And that was my big thing is, I was told I could gross $1,500 a week. Most I ever grossed was right at $1,100. So that was my biggest problem with Loudon. That is why I left. It wasn't worth it, to only gross $900. So then, let's say after tax, insurance, all that fun stuff, $600-700. I make that as a mechanic on a bad week. So it wasn't worth it to be gone from my family and to deal, with all the stuff, of course you ain't got a tarp, so at least that's decent, but all the securement and stuff, this was not worth it for that money. Now, as far as, to clarify, you have loads where you will make, and if I can figure out how to pull up and show you guys in a video my pay stubs, I will do this. I will try to figure out how to do this. I don't ever edit my videos, so I don't really know how. Just gonna be honest, I've always talked about that. I really don't know how to do all that stuff. I had a friend that was good at that, but he's dead, so sorry. But $1 a mile, pretty damn good pay as a company driver. That's amazing. But when you're only, if that load's only paying you $300 or $400 and you only do 3-4 of those a week, well then guess what? You're only making right at $900 to $1,000 in a week gross, and then you got to take taxes and everything out of that and your insurance. So it wasn't that great. If they had more loads, if loads picked up, and I know for a while the freight market was in a slump, so that could have been part of it. But I've also heard from a lot of drivers that it's been that way at Loudon for a really long time, and really ever since they were bought by P&S. So, that is why I left left Loudon. One other issue I had, the final issue I had with them, is when I was leaving, I had a family emergency come up at the same time and said, hey, look, this is what I got going on. I could take care of this. I can have this truck. I can't exactly remember. I want to say it was like a Monday, and I said I could have it back. Initially, I was going to bring it back Tuesday, but I was like, hey, I'm going to have to bring it back on Wednesday. This is what I got going on. And they were like, yeah, that's fine. We understand, no problem. And then they're like, hey, I think it was Night Shift called me and were like, hey, we need this truck back tomorrow. And I was like, well, we already talked about this. I'm going to have to bring it back on Wednesday. And like, well, we might have to have someone come get it. And I'm like, well, I'd rather y'all not do that. I don't want an abandonment on my record. And I said I would bring it back on this day, and I was already told that was okay. And never heard nothing back. And then I go to bring back the truck. It was like early Wednesday morning, and the truck wasn't there. So now, according to my stuff, it says, that my DAC report that it was, I'm satisfactory with them. That doesn't show anything about an abandonment. And according to my dispatcher, that I wasn't going to get marked as an abandonment. So far, that's been good, but there was that little worry there for a minute. But other than that, they've been cool. Nothing against them. I just hate that, really, and that's really the recruiter's fault for kind of, telling me that and it not being true. So other than that, they were a pretty good company. If things have picked up, loads have picked up, then they're probably doing pretty good. If you work for Loudon, tell me what you're making. Tell me if you're grossing that $1,500 a week or more, or what you're doing if you feel comfortable talking about that. that would be pretty cool. So, but I appreciate you guys watching. I guess I'm gonna go mow my yard. You guys have a great weekend. Peace.